The annual two sessions of the CPPCC and NPC were wrapped up with Premier Li Keqiang's press conference in Beijing, in which he fielded wide-ranging domestic, foreign, and international questions. So what are the biggest concerns about China's growth coming from home and abroad? How will the government reshuffle affect China in the near future? And what are the priorities on the leadership's agenda for the years to come? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhou Xiaochuan, who's the Vice President of the University of International Business and Economics, and also Mr. Adam Donat, Secretary General of the European Chamber in China and Vice Chair of European Business Organization Worldwide Network. We shall also talk to Robert Kep, Director of the Economist Corporate Network, and also Wang Guan, CGTN correspondent via satellite. Welcome to you all, and that's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Li Xiaochuan. Before we start, let's take a look at this.
As the top legislature passed a host of bills, work reports, and budget plans, the president gave a speech.
It is a noble duty and a great responsibility to serve as a president of the People's Republic of China.
President Xi Jinping, who begins his second term this week, did not go into detail about his plan for the next 5 years. Instead, he spent much of his speech concentrating on China's past.
China has always been a nation with dreams, a moderately prosperous society and a shared future for mankind, a part of what the Chinese nation has been fighting for and dreaming about for thousands of years.
Following centuries of prosperity, the first Opium War between the UK and Qing dynasty in the mid-19th century was a turning point for the country, and it took China more than 100 years to recover.
Today, more than ever, the Chinese people are closer to realizing the dream of national rejuvenation.
Over the past 40 years, China has risen from a poor, industrialized nation to become the world's second-largest economy. Chinese politicians believe the success is largely based on the country's political system and its determination to reform it for practical reasons. This year's NPC has approved a series of significant legislation to continue the system's development. Last week, the NPC passed a series of amendments to China's constitution, which includes articles to ensure a continuity in leadership and a more independent supervisory commission to fight corruption.
We must always be people-oriented. We must let the people be the masters of the nation. We must learn from our people, listen to their voices, and act on their wisdom. What the people advocate, what the people approve and accept must be the sole measurement of all of our work.
Xi Jinping also came down hard on the concept of territorial integrity, following U.S. President Donald Trump's signing of the Taiwan Travel Bill over the weekend.
Any action that aims to separate the country is due to fail and will be condemned by the people and punished by the history.
Xi Jinping pledged that China would never seek hegemony nor expansionism, saying that only those who regularly threaten other countries would perceive other countries as a threat. Strong confidence but tough work ahead as the clock ticks towards the deadline from the ambitious 2020 goals. This government has essentially 3 more years to eradicate poverty, provide nationwide internet access, and create a moderately prosperous society for all. Han Peng, CGTN, Beijing.
All right, gentlemen, let's talk about this. So today, the two sessions officially wrapped up, and the Premier gave a press briefing this morning. Professor Zhou, let me start with you. What do you think are the highlights coming from that press conference?
Well, the Premier Li Keqiang, addressed a variety of the topics. Some are very big, but some are very, very small. But this related to the people's, the life, and is covered in everything. I think this had very clear ideas for this new government's terms, how to identify their priorities, how to implement the strategy to achieve the goals, especially for the 2020 and even longer. So that I think this, and also with the restructure of this government, and they will be more efficient.
And what about you, Mr. Dunham? What do you find most interesting?
I think the Premier's commitment to continued opening up is a very positive sign for business. Particularly, I took note of the government work report where he said manufacturing sector will open up completely. That's very interesting if that's going to happen in 2018, as long as creating equal market entry standards for both Chinese and foreign banks. That really would be impressive.
Yeah, I want to also speak to our correspondent in Washington, D.C. Wang Guan is there for us. Wang Guan, you and I, as journalists, we know how crazy it is to cover the Chinese political season. I mean, it's extremely hectic and sometimes chaotic. There's so many things going on at one time. But among all those, what have caught your eyes the most?
Well, from yesterday's press conference, I think, well, today in Beijing, I certainly think that Premier Li Keqiang's measured tones and measured response when he was asked by Bloomberg about the potential U.S.-China trade war was notable in that, you know, he expressed the long-term view, long-term vision. He says that a trade war would be a lose-lose situation, and he says he appealed the U.S. side to loosen its high-tech export ban. That is something that is very, I think, very Chinese. You know, we do not provoke unless we're provoked first, and we opt to have a win-win situation.
And what about you, Mr. Cap? What are the things, if you were to name one thing that stand out to you the most during the entire political season here, what would that be?
Well, for the entire political season, it's basically been the concentration of power. That's what we've particularly taken note of in Western circles and outside of China. I don't know how much it's talked about inside China, but certainly the idea that whether it's the end of the presidential term limits or it's the new powers provided to anti-corruption bodies and the like, there's a huge concentration of power occurring in China that's very unlike what we see in the West, so that's extremely notable.
Yeah, and a number of questions being raised to the Premier around the world revolve around China's foreign policy and economic policies. And Mr. Dunham, you're the General Secretary of the European Chamber in China. You're probably more interested in how China plans to interact with European countries. So over the past 2 weeks, a lot of new things, reform plans, new appointments, new policies. What are the sense that you're getting on how China plans to interact with European partners?
Well, China's been a strong ambassador of globalization and increased trade and investment. The ongoing negotiations, I think the last one was actually a week or two ago between the EU and China related to the comprehensive agreement on investment, is probably the single biggest item that we're watching and would be the strongest symbol of progress that could take place between the EU and China from a business perspective.
And as one European scholar puts it, I'm quoting his words, if the U.S. has decided to go on a vacation, somebody needs to take over its responsibility, and this is really where the Europe-China G2 idea comes into play. What do you think of this notion, first of all? Do you like the sound of it?
It sounds attractive, but I'm less focused on titles and more interested in actual action. Those titles, I think, sometimes can have a negative connotation in certain circles. So I think most important is the EU and China working together on making a WTO system that works and making globalization that works.
Yeah, there's a certain level of sensitivity to that nation, too. Professor Zhao, what do you think about the idea?
Well, China and EU has a very long and a very close relation, especially for the trade economics. And I think, the two economies actually can play this vital role for the global trade system to make it much more open, much more sustainable, and much more practicable. And of course, there is some dispute between these two sides, but I think those should take action through negotiations and for the benefits of both sides.
But this, this idea of the scholar really feeds back to the discussion on the China threat theory, and similar question has been raised again today by journalists, one from America, the other one from Singapore. So despite what China says it never seeks hegemony, but a lot of people still do view China as the strategic rival to the United States, a potential challenger to the U.S. global supremacy, and there are growing talks on a possible trade war as a measure for the United States to punish China. What do you think the possibility of that to happen, first of all, Mr. Dunham?
I don't think we should undermine the possibility of that happening. I think it's very serious. Trump's been very outspoken. He's put forward these policies. He's created some exemptions in all this, but I think the whole world and business community is very concerned about this, and it deserves the attention that it's getting.
Yeah, and Wang Guan, what's your observation of Premier Li's statement on China-U.S. ties and trade wars? Is the trade war imminent?
I think from the Chinese side, Beijing made it very clear that we wanted to avoid a trade war at all costs. But here in the United States, in Washington in particular, you get a different feel of it. Since the beginning of 2018, the folks on the Capitol Hill have been beating the drums of China threat. The media, the establishment media in particular, are also, fanning the China fear-mongering. It's a concerted effort here. We're told that the White House can announce its new tariffs against China as big as hundreds of tens of billions of dollars as early as Thursday or Friday. So it's coming. It's coming whether China likes it or not. And I think now China should and need to prepare for the worst.
Well, Professor Zhao, do you agree with what's being said? It's coming, that China should get prepared.
Well, I think, for both sides, especially from China's side, we will take our efforts to avoid this war. And there's still some room for this, try to settle down this big dispute, and actually how you reduce the trade imbalance. It's not about the government, it's really for the enterprise, and they should give the favorable environment for the enterprises. For example, leave the restrict for the export to China, especially high tech, and this a long-term issue, and also that we're open to welcome China's investment in the U.S. And so there should be have this new thinking about the bilateral trade, not old thinking, winner and loser. That's too old.
Mr. Katz, let me get your thoughts on this. How do you look at the dynamics between the United States and China going onward?
Well, I think from the U.S. perspective, China started trade tensions by not having, even according to the Premier's remarks, he admits China needs to open more. It doesn't provide a fair environment. The United States is not alone in this. The EU, other trading partners of China, have all made this comment. What's interesting right now is you have a figure like Donald Trump, who's out there really aggressively promoting retaliation. But from a U.S. perspective, and I'm not taking a side here, but I am just explaining, it is looking like actually the U.S. is protecting itself against what's been a long period of unfair trade practices from China. So it's an attempt to rectify. But yes, it is aggressive. There's undeniably the way that the Trump administration is pursuing this is not friendly, really. And so that's what's leading to the concerns that it could evolve into something much worse, like a trade war.
So that's the perspective from the United States. What about the European Union, Mr. Dunnett? Oh, yeah, sure. Wang Guan, please jump in, please.
Well, I think that, of course, China needs to open up its financial services sector, for example, and better protect its intellectual property to address the U.S. concerns. But on the other hand, I think we need to take a hard look at the myth of this U.S.-China deficit. It really depends on how you look at it. The U.S. maintains a large service sector surplus with China, in fact. Its high-end manufacturing businesses, service businesses, those high value-added businesses, higher than with the U.S., with any other country in the world. And also, if you take out the intermediate goods, the goods that's shipped to China for assembly, the values counted towards the Chinese, but the values do not really belong to China. If you take out those goods, China's trade surplus with the U.S. can be cut by half. So it really depends on how you look at it.
So, Mr. Dunnett, I see you nodding your head. Before we get to the EU position, as an outside observer, how do you look at this dynamic? What do you make of what's been said by both sides?
Well, I would just add that China's not alone in this. There's a lot of countries around the world, including the European Union, that looks likely to be hit by this as well. And most other countries around the world have responded by saying something along the lines that we will protect our sovereign rights, we will respond accordingly. So I don't think people are going to sit by idly. I would recognize that China has taken some recent initiatives to reduce tariffs on agricultural and food products. Auto tariffs have come down a little bit. Any of those sorts of things will certainly please Chinese consumers and will be good for exporters from around the world as well. So I think you need, I think there's several approaches to dealing with this issue. But I'd echo what Robert said as well. This is not a sudden thing. I think there's a lot of built-up pressure in the system, and people are looking at all sorts of channels and avenues to address a much more complicated issue.
Yeah, another factor that could be deadly disruptive to the China-U.S. ties is the Taiwan Travel Act enacted by the United States. Wang Guan, let me get your thoughts on this. This is really touching China's bottom line, but why has Washington still decided to go ahead with it?
Well, this bill was co-sponsored by a congressman on the House, a frequent visitor to the island of Taiwan. Of course, this year going forward, there has been this China threat drum beating on the Hill, and senators, including Marco Rubio, are very enthusiastic about passing this bill. I think this bill really, what it really does is it contradicted the three communique, a very piece of document based on which U.S.-China recognizes diplomatic relations. If you look at Taiwan, or Republic of China as it calls itself, constitution, it claims the exact same territory as Beijing does. So you recognize either Beijing or Taipei as the one and only representative of Greater China. I mean, you cannot recognize both, because the constitutions of both areas, both regions, under two political parties, claim the same territory. I think people here in the U.S. don't necessarily fully appreciate the nuance of this issue. They frame the issue as if it's China versus Taiwan. You never see the Chinese mainland and Taiwan region appear on the front page. It's always China and Taiwan. You know, when it's framed this way, it sounds as if they're two different entities, two different countries. So the media is playing a part. The hawkish congressmen, the China hawks on the Hill, are playing a part of it. And also President Trump, it really didn't leave him with much space. He could only sign this deal because it was passed in the Senate and in the House unanimously.
Is it fair, Wang Guan, how the media is covering this issue?
Well, I certainly do not think it's fair. If you look at how they address the Taiwan's leader, for example, I did research on that. Out of 30 articles last year, they said Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, right? When you use the word president, it conjures up the image of a sovereign state. Whereas you could have used the word leader or authority of the Taiwan region, which will conjure up a different set of images. It really depends on how you frame this story. And also the U.S. media, the established media in particular, rarely mentions the history of it. The one sentence that is most often cited is Taiwan is considered a rebel, a breakaway province of China. That really portrayed Beijing as this aggressive force. But if you look at Taiwan's own constitution, it claims the exact same territory of both the island Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. Yeah,
and Professor Zhao, how would you anticipate China to respond if we do see U.S. politicians make official visits to Taiwan?
Well, that's a very serious, challenge to China. I think this that will break the line for.
Some even propose China could summon its ambassador back to the country.
Yes, maybe more actions can be taken, including this.
Would it be elevated to, something like the cross-strait crisis back to 1996, 1997?
But I suppose these gestures for event, and still we can wait and see, what's the real action by the officials from the U.S.
And Wang Guan, what do you think of this? How would China respond? You did research on that. How would you anticipate China to do?
Well, first of all, I think from Washington's perspective, the lawmakers, this generation of U.S. lawmakers need to realize when they signed this piece of, the three communique, which from their perspective, they ditched Taipei for Beijing, and now it looks like they're having second thoughts, because the Shanghai communique says explicitly they cannot have political ties with Taiwan. They can only have cultural, commercial, and cultural and people-to-people exchanges. So basically, you cannot eat the cake and have it too, right? From Beijing's perspective, I think we heard from President Xi very clear, loud and clear yesterday that no secessionist acts or tricks will be allowed. And the wording of President Xi was really the most strong, the toughest I've heard in recent years.
And Mr. Kap, how will the Taiwan Travel Act influence interactions between China and U.S.?
Well, we have to see what steps are taken. I would observe that, first of all, the phrasing that U.S. media and people use regarding Taiwan's administration is inconsistent with their own nomenclature. It is correct that the Republic of China, as it refers to itself officially, does claim the same territory. So there are some of those nuances there. But I don't think it's necessarily a mass campaign of trying to deceive people about the realities of what is a kind of de facto, in practice, separation, where at the same time legally both sides admit they're part of one and the same. But I don't think you can expect too much to happen. I doubt there'll be any sort of presidential visit from the U.S. side to Taiwan, and I don't think having some congressmen or people like that go to Taiwan actually represents that much of a threat to the status quo in that that was done before. But it is correct that the nuance that's changed here is that they will be going in an official capacity instead of just as cultural visitors.
All right, moving on to the economic issues, Professor Zhao, as the head of State Council, or the Chinese version of the cabinet, what are the challenges facing Premier Li in facilitating structural transformation of the country's economy?
Well, number one, is to be for the continued economic growth, and for this year, the target for the 6.5, and actually this is
attainable?
Attainable, yes, and but it's very important for. Meanwhile, you can guarantee the employment and more. Well, even 30 million, new employment, and plus some, poverty elevation. So that's, I think, this and then continue this the so-called supply side reform, and other, especially when we have this target for the poverty elevation in the year 2020, and so this will be some, especially the social guarantees for this. So that's the part of this structural reform.
And Mr. Dunnan, now it's been over a year since the expiry of Article 15 of the Protocol on China's accession to WTO. Yet there is no sign of China being granted as a market economy. What does China need to do to allay fears that China isn't a proper market economy?
I think the biggest concerns on the market economy it's got to do with prices. So I think a lot of companies talk about subsidies in China. They talk about pricing controls. Those are the areas where people feel, or land being given out special tax preference policies. But just to be clear on that issue, just last month, actually, or 2 months ago in January, the European Parliament actually approved the proposal for a new trade defense instrument system. And so this will remove the market economy, non-market economy status issue that exists with countries, and move it more to a specific focus on an ad hoc issue related to industry. So in that way, I think it should be helpful, more constructive. It reflects the realities that we face today.
And on financial reform, interestingly, U.S. educated economist Yi Gang has been named the next governor of PBOC, that's China's central bank, replacing Zhou Xiaochuan. And he's just one of the examples of the new generation of Chinese leaders or high-level officials. They are educated in the West. They have overseas experience. So presumably they will know the system better. They know what the world wants from China. What do you think? What kind of momentum will he bring to the country's financial reform, Professor?
Well, the governor Yi Gang, now we can also call him Professor Yi Gang, and he's a great economist, especially in econometrics. And he can actually he is very active still in the academic world, but he's very professional, regulators in this. And I think that he have a rich experience for the financial regulation, and also he puts the risk control as a priority. Meanwhile, he have a very clear idea that's how finance, the role of the finance towards the economy. So I suppose he will have his style for this.
Mr. Cap, a U.S. educated PBOC governor, what would you expect from him?
Well, I think it's more than his U.S. education, the fact that he's a protege of Zhou Xiaochuan. And Zhou Xiaochuan has kind of been like, if we refer it back to the Fed governorship under Alan Greenspan, someone who's overseen a long period of prosperity. Greenspan, later in hindsight, was not seen so good, but Zhou Xiaochuan has had a very positive reputation. So I think overall it's very reassuring to markets and investors, and there's a sense of optimism based on comments that have made about the reforms that we can expect going forward, including liberalization of the renminbi, and indeed investment that will be welcomed from foreign parties into the financial sector, with both China needs and foreigners are eager to participate in.
Yeah, I want to also touch upon the reforms that the government is going through. Mr. Dana, how do you look at the government reforms? How will this affect the projects, for example, that you are working on?
Well, I'm actually optimistic. I know a lot of people are concerned that this will create a slowdown and it'll be difficult to get meetings, and certain reform initiatives will be slowed down while it takes time for the new ministries to set up. But some of the statements that have been coming out of the Chinese government from the top leadership have been very clear. Again, the government work report, I think, hints towards potentially a new foreign investment catalog. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that maybe happening around the Boao forum time. I think that would be a nice surprise for everybody. But these government restructurings, it happens in all countries around the world. I think it's good in that it energizes people. And in many sectors there has been either overlap or this sort of silo mentality thinking when it comes to dealing with issues. So getting everybody under one roof for certain areas, I think would be good. Going back to pricing as well, the market supervision, that will be good for dealing with anti-monopoly issues, I think.
And Mr. Cap, how do you look at the institutional reform of Chinese government and the efforts of trying to make the government more service-oriented? How is it impacting your business?
Well, in that I work with a media company on one side, we also provide advisory services. Until there's more restrictions lifted on media, I don't expect much changes there, and that doesn't seem likely. But in terms of general advisory services, which we also provide, we'll have to see what the details are, but I think that's great. I think that we do in fact supply data to the Chinese government. They're a big client of ours. We're very happy with that, and we would love to see the government take more of a service, a data-based scientific approach to what it does. That would be good for both sides.
And Wang Guan, over to you. What has been reported on the institutional reforms from where you are? What are observers or China watchers saying about this?
Well, quite a number of things. I think some of them are pleased to see that the agencies have been, 24 agencies are affected. They're either retooled, revamped, and it's becoming leaner and more efficient, hopefully. And also, when I talk with them, I often give them this example. When you try to curb pollution in the old days, you have to go to different ministries. The Ministry of Agriculture, if it's farmlands that is polluted, if it's in the ocean, you go to the Oceanic Administration, and if it's in the lakes and rivers, you go to Ecological Environment. Now they're all under one roof. Things like this are happening. Numerous ministries get streamlined. Entrenched interests are expected to be touched. And more importantly, I think this could really stop the self-destructive turf wars between different ministries with overlapping functions.
All right, great discussion. Thank you all. We're running out of time. We have to go. Mr. Wang Guan, my colleague in D.C., and also Mr. Robert Cap joining us via satellite in the studio, Professor Zhou Xiaochuan and Mr. Adam Dunn. And thank you all for joining us. And that does it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.